Hi, this is Scott Coleman, and welcome to Key Strategies for Reducing Third-Party Risk. I apologize that Ian Walter is not available today for the presentation. Okay, so 583, that's the average number of connections that organizations have to third parties. So these are vendors that you work with, partners that you work with, folks that might be doing monitoring information based on equipment that's operating in your plant or your facility. What we're talking about is how do you mitigate the risk associated with those connections. Now, most of those connections have legitimate reasons for being there, for having those connections, in order for you to run and operate your business. So there's no way to eliminate all of those connections, certainly, and they have practical and appropriate reasons for being there. But how do we manage them so that they're much more secure? Okay. So some of those connections would include cloud services we see today all the time, software vendors that provide information and technology that you operate inside your plant, disaster recovery solutions, IT support, utility information, just your security systems in general, industrial control systems, etc. Lots of different reasons for those connections, all legitimate, and then lots of different vendors that are supplying that information. So like your Rockwell Collins or your GE or Cisco, etc. So lots of different connections, lots of different vendors providing those connections or utilizing those connections for many different reasons. So what does that look like, right? So imagine your facility there in the center, and you've got all these different connections, and whether you're connecting out to the cloud or you've got SLAs in place with some of your vendors, or you need to do remote monitoring, whether it's security or just plant operations monitoring, etc. You've got logistics companies and disaster recovery, lots of things we mentioned on the previous slide. And really what you're doing is you're saying, hey, I need to work with these companies. These are important parts of my business, and I need to exchange information with them. So legitimate reasons for doing this. But one of the threats here is that you are now, once you connect them to your network, you're relying on their cybersecurity to protect your network. In essence, you're opening yourself up. So how do you prevent yourself from opening up? How do you maybe mitigate or reduce that number of 583 to something that's more manageable? So if you think different strategies, number one, keep and maintain a third-party inventory, abide by least privilege principles, network segmentation and defense in depth, and what does that look like, risk-based cybersecurity, and then zero trust. So we're going to go through each of those areas. Okay, so starting with keeping and maintaining a third-party inventory. What this really means is of that 583, who are they? What do they have access to? Basically, if you don't know they exist, if you don't know why that connection exists and why people are exchanging information with you or you're sending information to them, you can't secure it. You can't secure it properly. You can't apply the appropriate policies or strategies to make sure the information that is being exchanged is appropriate for what the need is. And of course, unauthorized or unknown connections are very common, right? Especially when you're talking to the cloud or just those third-party vendors, so you don't know what they're in turn connected to. Especially if you're outside of your physical security, boundary. So whether it's at your actual plant or another headquarters, maybe a separate in your plant. Once you get outside of your physical boundary, how do you apply that cybersecurity? Okay. So next we're going to look at least privilege principles. What this is saying is every organization should have layers of protection, right? And segmentation between those layers. So the people that are accessing layer one, your outermost layer, are the ones that are you want to provide the least protected types of information to. And then as you get closer and closer to that center of the circle, those are the things that are your most sacred intellectual property, your processes, your recipes, financial data, customer data, etc. The closer you get to that circle, the more important it is that information be secured. So the people that have access and authorization to access information at layer one should be a much larger number of people than access to layer four. So the closer you get to the center there, the fewer and fewer people actually get access to it. And in each layer, you're evaluating and saying, where does this person need to get to? How far in to my organization is appropriate for the things that need to get to? And so it's all about creating segments and potentially doing one-way transfers of information from your higher level secure areas to your lower levels and moving data out rather than allowing people in. It's all about preventing people from getting in, but sharing the information that's necessary to run and operate your business. Okay, so as we look at that, as you move through those segments from those different areas, from layer 1 out down to layer 4, no one of those layers can be secured with a single device, a single application, a single solution, right? This is all about defense in depth. We provide products called data diodes. You can see that those sit out there at the network boundary typically, although they're getting moved further and further closer to the core as they're doing endpoint protection or single device protection. Nothing is a silver bullet. Everything needs to be secured in layers. Despite what kind of security it provides, everything needs a backup. Everything needs to be, nothing can be relied on independently. So again, you look at the outside and you work your way in and think about what is the right layers based on where you are in the organization. Okay. The other thing you have to think about is your risk. Where are you at most risk? Where are you most vulnerable? And work towards the most extreme or highest area of risk combined with what's most critical for your business operations. So you're going to attack, you're going to take resources. Everyone has limited resources. So you're going to think about where do I want to apply those resources that I have, the limited resources, and make sure that I'm not overprotecting things that are very low risk and low impact to the business versus those that do have a lot of risk and or critical to the operations. So you can apply different technologies at different points along that spectrum that are appropriate for the things that you're protecting. So like in that earlier picture, we had multiple circles, the things at the core of that circle, that layer 4, those are where you're going to apply your most ardent security device, the things that can protect the most while continuing to share data and keep business operations up and running. Because without the ability to share data, then your business really isn't going to be operational. Okay. All right. Zero trust. Now, this is things that people talk about all the time, but really, this is the most difficult one to achieve. If you look at your workflows, how people and entities interact with your data there, obviously, when it comes down to data, data is the thing that you're trying to protect, right? It's the data related to customers, to their account numbers, to your intellectual property, to what machines are operating and not operating. What levels things are operating at, right? What's the throughput, what's the electric load, et cetera, all that comes down to data these days. Everything is digital. And then you look at your networks and how that data traverses your networks. You look at the devices consuming and contributing data to your operation and the people that are using it. And it's all about, unlike the trust but verify, in this model you want to verify everything and trust no one. The hypothesis here, the theory here is that if I don't trust anything, then I can implement the most secure environment possible. Now, that is hard when you're exchanging information because you do at some point have to trust people. You have to trust that some of the data coming through. But you can architect a solution so that as you're moving data in one direction, it doesn't present a threat to the entity that it's coming from or going to. And again, that's where some of the technology like data diodes can be used, where I can push data into a collaborative workspace, a common workspace, without having people access or come back through that entry point and turning that into a risk to my business. Okay, so if you think about the spectrum of security, where on the spectrum do your protective services, the applications and the things that you're applying sort of sit? If you look all the way to the far right, you'll see there's a data diode. And just short of physically connecting and disconnecting yourself 1%, 100% from the networks is a diode. Some would actually argue that a diode is actually more secure than an air gap. And the reason for that is a diode allows you to exchange information without allowing a risk to come back into your network. So let me talk about how a data diode works briefly, and that sort of answer the question about how something that actually prevents things can actually be better for your business in terms of exchanging information and more secure. So a diode works on the principle that is just like an electrical diode. A data diode allows data to only move in one direction. There is typically a LED sending light across a fiber optic cable to an LED, which can receive that light or data as it moves across, but there is no corresponding return LED to send light backwards through, and no receiving photoreceiver. So literally the data or light can only go in one direction, preventing anything that moves through that data diode from coming back through it. Therefore, there is no threat vector, there's no way malware or anything else can get through that diode. Now, by having such a device in place and having this extremely secure barrier or point on my segment, my microsegments or different segmentation, I can share data and to the outside world or the outside segment or the outside layer, wherever that data needs to go, without a threat coming back through. In doing so, I'm no longer stopping people from exchanging information. And one of the weakest reasons that cybersecurity gets weakened is people bypass things. It becomes too difficult, right? Cybersecurity is never an easy thing. It's always a hassle. Just like security at the airport, is hard for people because it makes them do extra things. Cybersecurity in general makes people do extra things or give up privileges or not be able to access things that they want to. Now, if you give them a security device like a data diode that allows information to flow freely out from one segment from a trusted environment to the untrusted environment where it may need to be consumed, i.e. from your plant out to your third parties, to your vendors, to your software vendors, to your monitoring center, etc., easily, then people are less apt to try and bypass it. So the bypass is the sort of Achilles heel of cybersecurity. If I can get around it somehow and I don't have to follow the rules, now I'm threatening the organization. So a data diode absolutely ensures that data can only move in one direction, but it allows data to be shared. Therefore, as a consumer of that data, I no longer have to give that data up, and therefore I'm not tempted to try and bypass that or get around it somehow. I can actually embrace that security and use it. Now, if we go back to the fact that a data diode is hardware-based and not software-based, we can then compare it to things like firewalls. So firewalls, of course, while they run on a physical appliance sometimes, they're actually software-based. What that means is configuration-based, configuration enforcement. So the configuration of the firewall determines what it does and doesn't allow. Compare that to the physics on the data diode, which says, hey, this beam of light can only go in one direction, i.e. this data can only flow in one direction. There's no second guessing, there's no misconfiguring a diode. It's going to move light in one direction only, and you can't be misconfigured. So the physics are the founding principle of hardware enforced cybersecurity versus software configured firewalls. That also means that as a software-based configuration, like a firewall, you're susceptible to zero-day exploits and malware and ransomware, and then you have to manage the firewall. So you have a lot of ongoing management, which, if not kept up with, creates its own vulnerability. Now all of a sudden you're falling behind in terms of your updates or patches or whatever needs to get done, and we've seen customers who have failed their own audits because they've been unable to keep up with the changes needed for for firewalls. So it's not that the technology probably doesn't work, but it's just the folks that work in the plants, they have their day jobs to do, and part of that may or may not be keeping firewalls up to date. And so if you can't keep your firewall up to date, then you might as well not have it. Because it gives you a false sense of security because it's no longer valid. So by using hardware, it's unhackable. You can't change the components that are missing, i.e. the LED and the photoreceiver to send light back through, don't exist. So you can't hack through it because you can't put a malware or something different on there to make it behave differently because the components just don't exist. making it invulnerable to malware. And because the hardware, the security is in the hardware, there's little to no ongoing management. So it allows you to sort of set it and forget it. Now, not literally, but we do have customers that have gone years without having to manage or change the configuration, because once it's up and running and the data is flowing through it, there's really very little need to ever have to change it, unlike a firewall. Okay, so recommendations for implementation. We've talked about things you need to do mitigate, and the technology itself. Sort of how would you actually implement a data diode or that kind of thing. Department of Homeland Security in the United States, along with the FBI and NSA, actually got together and put together this white paper talking about how to protect systems. And so 3 of those things, you'll see number 3, they're reducing your attack surface, creating a defendable environment, and implementing secure remote access, all play specifically to this idea of third-party, mitigating third-party attacks and those interactions. So if we look at those closely, we'll see what the DHS recommends. Number 1, reduce or eliminate connections in and out of the network. So this is go back to the number, the 583 number, the total number of connections. If you can reduce that number of 583, then you have many fewer connections that you actually have to worry about, period, because either A, they're outdated, maybe you're not working with that vendor anymore, the connection's not needed because you've got a new application, or whatever reason why. Again, reduce what you don't need to just reduce your overall cybersecurity threat footprint. Number 2, they recommend convert two-way connections to one-way out of the plant. So if you think about a monitoring center, and a lot of people say, oh, you do remote monitoring. Well, it's not really remote monitoring. It's remote monitoring with remote access, meaning I'm out in my monitoring facility. In order to create my dashboard, I'm going to reach in, grab data, pull it out of the network, and then I'm going to display it. So that's remote monitoring with remote access. With a one-way data push through a diode, you can actually, instead of reaching in, we do a one-way push, then you're doing true remote monitoring without remote access. The data gets out, the people consume it, they need to, I can do my dashboards, etc., but no one's ever actually needed to reach into the plant to get that data. The other part of this plays is converting a two-way connection to a one-way into the plant. So we've got the one-way push of data out. Now we think about things like software patches that need to get in. By restricting that, constraining that two-way connection into a one-way into the plant, now again I can apply my defense in depth strategies, my segmentation strategies, etc. about that data coming in, and can tightly control it. And I know that my one-way in cannot be a point of egress. There's no way data can come back out that one way, because a data diode will control it and say this is only going to flow one direction. And then the last bit they say is, okay, you can't always convert everything to one-way in or out. You still sometimes need those two-way connections for maybe remote command and control or other mechanisms that demand a two-way connection. And in that case, we use the analogy of like security at the airport, where if I go into the airport, they scan me, they check my ID, they check my ticket, they scan my bag, and now I fly wherever, and I land, and I come back out. Now, when I go back out, I don't go through that same one-way path that I used on the way in. I go through another one-way path that has a guard sitting there, and literally, if I pass the guard and the line on the floor, I can't go back in. So 2 one-way paths, completely autonomous, know nothing about each other, but as a passenger, you've made a round trip. We do the same thing with a TCP/IP connection, for example. So you could do a one-way trip, round trip of TCP/IP, initiated from the inside, from the secure side, out and then back, again, allowing an outside entity to have two-way communication, but not doing anything beyond that. So it's a very locked down two-way connection that is only allowing for that which is designated. So you're applying cybersecurity to those things. Now, by doing these conversions, by moving to two-way and one-way, you're reducing your overall threat vectors and what can be your points of attack against your network. Okay, so in summary, map your network, eliminate unnecessary connections, i.e. reduce the 583. Convert as many two-way connections to one-way pushes of data as possible, one-way in and one-way out. Vet your remaining inbound connections, convert, right? Limit and monitor those connections. So whatever you've got in terms of two-way, this is where this is on that risk scale, this is where you're going to apply as many resources as possible, because this is your two-way, this is the ones that are most vulnerable, and then make sure to implement defense in depth to all those connections, whether they're one-way or two-way. Always use more than one mechanism to defend your network. So I appreciate your time. I hope you learned something, and thank you for your attention.